All right. So when it comes to the epidemiology of like, personal training, as we're looking at, as we're looking at working with special populations is, we're estimating that about 90 million Americans are currently living with some form of chronic disease, some form of like chronic health condition, whether that is general low back pain, osteoporosis, heart disease, or, some of the more like rare ones that actually aren't necessarily covered in your book, like, neurological disorders, multiple sclerosis, things like that. But like we know that 90 million folks are living with this, and so like that's a lot of people who want to improve their overall health and their lifestyle, right? And so my favorite example is actually one of the diseases that isn't even necessarily covered in our textbooks, but what I think is probably the best example of our role in the industry, right? Let's say you've got a client with multiple sclerosis, right? So just to give you guys a little bit of background here, if we look at multiple sclerosis, well, I got it, multiple sclerosis. What this is actually a nervous system disorder where the nervous system gets damaged. And your nervous system gets damaged because of your own immune system. So it's an autoimmune disease where basically your immune system starts eating or attacking the myelin sheath within our neurons. So if you look at like, you look at a neuron, right? It obviously has like, all of that anatomy that we kind of covered last course, but you can see, right? Like there's the overall neuron's body, and then it's got this big long tail here. That tail is covered in this fatty material called myelin, and that myelin protects the electric signal as it runs from the body of the neuron down to like the terminals, right? But unfortunately, for some reason, we don't really fully understand why, which is why we can't cure this darn disease yet, is we see that like the immune system actually eats away at that myelin. It attacks it as if it's some sort of like foreign invader. And so that damages the myelin, and nervous system signals get lost. They get stuck. So sometimes they'll experience like burning sensations or numbness or tingling, sometimes pain. Oftentimes in like, usually travels down to the legs. But one of the things is like basically, imagine like, we know that like the nervous system is going to send a constant like signal after the next signal after the next signal, and that's how it like contracts our muscles. But if you damage that signal, let's say one of those signals gets lost, you'll often see like people with MS, they'll lose their balance really quickly because they'll lose a sensation in their leg, so they'll tend to like be pretty tipsy on their feet. They have a really hard time like balancing properly. Now, we can't treat MS. We don't, I mean, there's certain medications that maybe suppress the immune system a little bit, but we don't fully understand MS. However, I've worked with a few clients over the years who have dealt with this. And one of the things that is absolutely true is that you may not necessarily be able to treat the disease, but you can improve their overall health through exercise. And we do a lot of balance training and a lot of core training in fitness, right? So if you improve someone's overall balance, you can't necessarily keep that disease from interrupting a signal and all of a sudden they lose their balance. But what you can do is you can train them to be much faster on their feet, much more reactive, and be able to like not fall all the way to the ground. They might stumble for a second, but they can regain their balance very quickly because they've sort of trained for that in general, right? And that's kind of an example of how like we can have a very positive impact on someone's life living with one of these conditions, even if we are not necessarily treating a condition directly. And so that's my favorite example of that. Obviously, there's other ones out there. There's going to be plenty of conditions that are not listed in your textbook. If you guys ever do really want to get into special population training and you want to work in the realm of corrective exercise, ACSM special populations. Let me see if I can find this textbook. Yeah. Oh, that's NSCA. No. Nice try, other personal training certification. Yeah, I would say that this textbook right here which is fairly expensive. You know, these textbooks are always so expensive. But if you really do want to work with like a lot of like special populations and know how to sort of deal with chronic diseases within the realm of like personal training, our PowerPoints actually came from this textbook. NASM wrote them, but they sort of used ACSM in order to like create this material. And ACSM is like one of NASM's probably like, it's probably NASM's biggest competitor, which is kind of funny, but obviously like, you know, they all sort of work together in this industry. But if you do want to if you find that like you really want to get into this and like, you know a lot about like every single condition out there, this textbook will do you pretty well. And it's $50, which is obviously a lot for a freaking book. But let's see here. ACSM special population. You can always do my favorite approach to things, which is get like the older edition. Actually, I don't see it up here. Third. Huh. May not be able to buy it anymore. Oh, there it was. Hey, this one. So here's the third edition. This one should be a little cheaper. Yeah, $16. Sounds not so bad, you know. But it's obviously it's a little bit outdated, but it's basically going to have like set, rep, and intensity recommendations for various different diseases out there. So we're going to see that information anyways. We're just going to see it sort of boiled down a little bit in like a table version in your NASM. So okay, so like I said, about 90 million people living with some type of chronic disease. That number is likely going to rise in the future. So for instance, you know, I'm sure that that's how many Americans are living with a chronic health condition. That number was from like, yeah, okay, this is way worse. So that's about 133 million currently. That is a substantial rise. I will say that statistic I know is from 2015. So that is quite some time ago. But that number is likely to rise in the future, which obviously it has. With advances in modern medicine, obviously we've got people who are living longer, and so the more people who are going to be living with specific conditions who are looking to, you know, improve their overall life. So the big one that we're going to see, and my mom struggles with this, leading cause of death in the United States is currently cardiovascular disease. So the thing that kills us in the United States more than anything else is heart disease, which if you guys remember, like I had like a little rant where we were talking about like ankle sprains, we were talking about like knee problems and stuff like that. And I was like, those are non-contact injuries. Like it was like 60% of ACL tears are non-contact, right? That's more than half of them are non-contact, which means it really shouldn't have been an injury. You know, like no one tackled this person. They didn't tear, you know, soft tissue because they got tackled. They didn't tear it because they got punched in the side of the leg. You know, like they tore it because like maybe they stepped into a hole and their body wasn't really ready to like stabilize or didn't know how to stabilize properly. And so it got injured because it simply couldn't stretch properly or couldn't stabilize properly or strengthen properly, right? That's kind of how I feel about cardiovascular disease. Like cardiovascular disease is not something that you're inherently born with. It's something that we develop through like sedentary lifestyles and you know, poor diet. Now, here's the thing that I'll say, guys, like for the record, like if you have a genetic predisposition for cardiovascular disease, you might be, you know, a little bit predisposed to it. So for instance, this is actually why when you go into the doctors, they ask you like, does your family have a history of heart disease or diabetes or anything like that? People who have diabetes, sometimes they are a little predisposed to it. You know, their insulin sensitivity is a little bit off due to like different receptors in the body. Maybe they're just born that way. That's their genetics, right? Same thing is true of heart disease. You might have like cholesterol receptors that are a little bit more or less sensitive than someone else. So I will say there is some genetic component to this, but certainly not enough of a genetic component to see 53% of the population dying from like I'm sorry, not 53%, that's actually way too much. 53% being like coronary artery disease, and it being the leading cause of death in the US. Causes of heart disease being, yeah, about 696,000 of them. Percentages, 20% of the population. So you know, 1 out of 5 people dying from heart disease, right? Obviously the biggest cause of death is like everything else that's going to happen, you know, like you know, like they'll everything put together. But even on just this list, right, we see cancer at about 20%. COVID-19 is on this list now at about 10%. That's frustrating. Accidents, you know, unintentional injuries and things like that. Other cardiovascular diseases, which by the way, like this and chronic lung diseases absolutely belongs up here, which would even boost that even further. Alzheimer's, diabetes, influenza, it's a really big one. So yeah, obviously it's, you know, there's a lot of things out there. And we only have so much effect on those things, but cardiovascular disease, right? If you keep your heart nice and strong, if you keep those blood vessels clear, you know, you're much less likely to kind of struggle with this. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so important for us to lead active, healthy lifestyles and engage in healthy diets. So the CDC is going to support the fact that like physical inactivity is probably the biggest underlying major cause of premature mortality in the US. It's a big fancy way of saying being sedentary is the #1 thing that is killing us. We do need to be more physically active. And here's the thing, you know, you look at it and it's like, well, there's more gyms now than there's ever been, you know, and there's more gym memberships being used now, and yet we're still seeing like more and more heart disease. What's the deal? And it's like, well, here's the kind of bummer part of it, you know, like I work out pretty regularly, you know, like by pretty regular I mean 6 days a week, like every day, you know, every week of the year, you know, like maybe not every week of the year, you know. But there are days where, you know, I've got my little, you know, step tracker here, and I remember when like quarantine first broke out, and it was like, you know, I was like, well, this sucks. I'm stuck in my house, but thank goodness I have access to a driveway. And so, you know, and I have access to the park. And so like, you know, when things were, you know, first happening, I was just like, well, I guess I'm back on a running routine. You know, I kind of got back into to long distance running, you know. And I was like, there's not going to be any marathons for a while, but I can still train for one, you know, like, and it was kind of a nice thing, you know. During that time, I was getting out of the house, getting a lot of, you know, getting a lot of physical activity. But it was funny, like as we transferred to sort of the slightly less severe version of quarantine, you know, I actually was like, oh, okay, well now I can, you know, actually head to the park again. Because before it was like, you remember like very early stages where it was like you weren't even necessarily supposed to go to like public parks, you know. It was like this major panic, and it was like, you know, even outdoors was sort of off limits. So like during that time I was doing like trail runs, you know, like I was going out to Malibu and things like that. But like during that middle phase, where I was like, oh well, I'm really committed to this like running thing again, and it's like now I can go to the park and stuff. I ended up like running like less distances because I was like, well, now I can do sprints because I'm actually in a park and level surface and stuff, and I can get back to sort of like the way I like to train, right? And then once things sort of went back to like normal, and as I built like sort of like my own gym, you know, I went back to like, oh, okay, well now I can get back into more of the strength training, like the way that I like to do it, right? So I kind of got back on a regular schedule pre-pandemic, you know, just in my backyard instead of like, you know, being out in the world and stuff. But here's what that's very fascinating. Here's why I bring this up for myself as a personal example. Even with all of that, even with all of the extra running, the sprints, or the like working out at home, being physically active, if you looked at the number of steps that I was getting, and I'm not a big fan of like counting steps personally, but if you looked at the number of steps that I was getting, it would be lower than my normal lifestyle was. So like my old schedule was, get up, go to the gym, come home, shower, go leave the house, head to Sochi, work for a couple hours. And like while I was at Sochi, like one of the things about like my room, and I don't know if they did this on purpose because like I was the personal fitness program, but like Mo and I's classrooms were as far away from the printer as possible in the building. And so like we would both like talk about this all the time. Whenever we would print something, we would have to like walk, and I would always take the stairs and come back and like down the stairs, like one level because it was 2 levels. And it was a whole thing. And I would always get like, they say you're supposed to get 10,000 steps a day. I would get my 10,000 before noon every single day. And now I find that I'm struggling to even hit that 10,000. And so it's just a different, more sedentary lifestyle, right? We definitely know that like obesity is going to be on the climb due to like all of this quarantine stuff. We are seeing this, but here's what's really like kind of exciting in some ways. We do know that every time something like this happens, every time there's a major health scare in the world, people start to take their health really more, like much more seriously. So it is going to be fascinating to see what happens in the next 10 years in the fitness industry. We are going to see some probably pretty cool stuff in the next 10 years. You guys definitely have some jobs coming down the line. I can almost guarantee that, we're going to see much more. We're seeing people get away. Like, I think one of the big revolutions that we're seeing is like, now that people have sort of learned how to work out from home, we're seeing much more. Like, I have gotten advertisements nonstop for like these training services that like send a trainer to your house. So like in-home private training and stuff. I think that is where chances are a lot of you guys are probably going to find the most space within the fitness industry, if that's what you end up like wanting to do. So anyway, I'm kind of sidetracking myself a little bit here, but we know that physical activity is the big thing, right? And it's fascinating to have this idea of like how physically active you are, but then see the reality of how that might not necessarily match up all the time. Like I was like, oh, well, my lifestyle hasn't changed that much. I'm still working out every day. I'm just doing it in my driveway. But that little bit of like, not getting into the, walking to the car, going to the gym, leaving the gym, those little changes, they make a difference. Now think about like, think about like what it's like to be able to throw your laundry in and just like leave it and go, change it maybe a couple hours, an hour later or so. And then just like, what does everybody do? My girlfriend was joking about this. You throw it on your bed and then it goes to the chair and then it goes back to your bed. You think about like living a lifestyle like that versus like what we used to have to do back in the day, which is like, scrub that crap and then like hang it up on like a wire, right? Totally different lifestyle. So we see obesity climb, and maybe it's not necessarily related to the fact that, yeah, there are more gyms in the world, but I'd say like our overall lifestyle is just more sedentary. We're able to throw stuff into a dishwasher, right? We're able to use a Roomba, to sweep our floors for us. Those little changes are making our life more convenient in a lot of ways, but they could be explaining why obesity is sort of outpacing our ability to be more physically active. So we know that this is like, we don't necessarily know the direct cause of obesity, but we do know that like obesity and heart disease are the #1 killers of people in the US. And we also know that an active, fit way of living is a much more cost-effective, it's a very safe and very efficacious approach to reducing this chance of like dying from these preventable diseases. So that's where we are. That's my longest intro ever. So let's just take a look at some specific examples of these conditions that we're talking about here and why we know we can have a positive effect on them. So secondary prevention coming from cardiovascular disease, right? So we do know that cardiovascular disease is a sort of a secondary prevention to what we call hypertension, right? So hypertension is going to be high blood pressure. And we call this secondary prevention, by the way, because it's not necessarily like a direct like pill or treatment you're taking, right? It's like a doctor is going to maybe put you on a medicine to reduce your blood pressure, but then they're also going to encourage you like, hey, you need to start exercising more regularly, right? So hypertension, guys, this is our first disease of the day. You are going to want to definitely know all the definitions of these conditions, which is why we're sort of putting them all up here. But hypertension, probably one of the biggest ones. This is a fancy way of saying high blood pressure. So when I say high blood pressure, what I mean is blood pressure that at rest exceeds 140/90. So your resting blood pressure is above 140/90. So what do those numbers mean? Well, the 140 is known as your systolic pressure. The 90 is known as your diastolic pressure. Ideally, those pressure numbers should be 120/80 or about that. Chances are if you guys have been in to the doctor anytime recently, you might have noticed that it was maybe even a little bit lower than that. It's pretty common. I hear that from students all the time. Again, it's a school for personal trainers. We're going to see that a lot. But ideally, we do want that to be, somewhere around 120/80. Okay. And those numbers, the systolic pressure, that's known as like the systole of your heart. When your heart squeezes, that's known as systole. So the beat of the heart is systole. And so there's a lot of pressure through the tube. So the pressure pushing on the walls of your arteries should be about 120 units of pressure. Okay. And then when your heart relaxes, that's known as diastole. And there's still pressure, even though the heart is relaxing, but the pressure is obviously going to be much lower. And so there should be about 80 units of pressure. But let's say your arteries are very hard due to maybe you just consistently are stressed out. And so they actually, the tunics within your arteries and the muscles within your arteries actually get a little bit overdeveloped, overactive, similar to our posture muscles. That causes them to kind of be stiff. And so then they don't expand the way they're supposed to. That's going to increase pressure. It's running the same amount of water through like a thinner tube, or a stiffer tube. That's going to raise pressure. So stress can lead to hypertension. Increased sodium, excessive sodium intake can do that because sodium ions basically harden the area as well. But probably the biggest one is going to be plaque buildup. So plaque is what happens. That's what we call excessive little lipids building up on the inside of our blood vessel walls. So basically, you'll get like a little bit of like fat that will build up on the inside of an artery. And now, your arteries are normally very smooth. And your red blood cells, which are, these little tiny like cells that are moving through, these arteries, they can get like caught on that hard, textured material. That's why we need this to be so smooth. So we start to see this build up right here. We're going to start to call that atherosclerosis, which is a fatty buildup on the inside of our blood vessels, right? So then another fat cell builds up on it, another one, right? Until eventually it really starts to clog the entire area. Now, this is what we know as advanced plaque, right? Or advanced high cholesterol. Now, look at how thin this tube is right here, right? Obviously, it's going to be very difficult to get the same volume of blood moving through this much smaller tube, right? So the pressure is going to be much, much, much higher. And then eventually what can happen actually, and this is more of a cholesterol problem than just a hypertension problem, but those red blood cells can actually start to clot because that's what they do when they stop moving. And so when they start to clot, you can get a blood clot in there. Eventually that can clog like a major artery, and that can lead to a stroke or heart attack, and that's what we mean when we say like cardiovascular disease. So hypertension, this is sort of an early warning sign. It's like, hey, like something's going on, and it's increasing like the pressure within your arteries, at baseline. Now, just so you guys know, your blood pressure can spike and drop drastically throughout the day. When you're working out, your blood pressure's through the roof. I think like the one of the highest ever recorded blood pressures. I don't know why they did this, but they were just, I'm sure they were just curious. But they tested someone's blood pressure during like a maximum intensity deadlift, and their blood pressure was like 500 over 300 or something like that. Some crazy, crazy, crazy high number. Is that dangerous? No, not really. Blood pressure that's excessively high during exercise, we call that essential hypertension. It's like it's essential that you have high blood pressure in this moment because it's allowing blood to move to the right parts of your muscles and stuff. Where it becomes a problem is when you are at rest and you have high blood pressure. That's showing us that your cardiovascular system is not working the way it's supposed to. So I want you guys to definitely know that definition and get familiar with these numbers. Ideally, it should be 120 over 80. Everyone should know that. And then 140 over 90 is where we consider it to be a problem. If it was like 130 over 85, we call that pre-hypertension, which isn't really a disease. So that's hypertension. One of the other biggest common ones we are going to see is diabetes. So diabetes, mainly type 2, is going to be the most problematic. This is the 6th leading cause of death in the US, or at least it was. And this is impaired glucose control. So there are 2 types of diabetes. For those of you who aren't familiar, type 1 diabetes is a genetic condition. This is actually an autoimmune disorder, very similar to multiple sclerosis. Remember, multiple sclerosis is sort of an overactive immune system. For some reason, it attacks our neurons. Well, in this case, type 1 diabetes is an overactive immune system for some reason attacking our pancreas. So your pancreas's job in your body is to produce insulin. Insulin is the hormone that, while it's running through your blood, tells your body to take glucose, sugar molecules, from the blood and drive them into your cells. So glucose drives, insulin drives glucose into body cells, okay? Now, that's great because now that our cells have glucose, you know what they can do? They can produce energy. Love that, and that keeps us alive and allows us to do everything we do, right? We call that glycolysis. But it also drives it from our blood into, like, let's say it drives it into the cell and the cell's like, yeah, I'm not doing anything right now, and so the cell's like, oh, well, I don't need to produce energy right now. Well, what happens to that glucose? Well, instead, it will get converted into a triglyceride, and then it will store it as like fat, right? So insulin is either it's going to do basically one of 3 things. It's either going to send it into the cell to produce energy, or it will send it into your glycogen stores to be held on as glucose to be used later, or it'll convert it into a fat cell. And so if your glycogen stores are consistently filled, because maybe you're not doing a lot of physical activity, your body has no reason to pull that glucose out of your blood and turn it into glycogen. Instead, it'll pull it out of your blood and turn it into triglycerides and store it as a fat cell. And now you've got long-term stored energy instead of short-term stored energy, right? It's just like, your money comes from your paycheck, it goes into your checking account when you spend out of your checking account consistently, right? But let's just say like your spending's a little low, or maybe you're making an excessive amount of money, right? And you just notice that your checking account goes up and up and up and up and up, right? And it's like, well, it's not my, all that excess money is not doing anything for me in my checking account. What should I do with it? I'm going to pull it out and put it into a savings account where it can earn interest, right? So then you put it into the savings account, and now it's like, yeah, I got it for a rainy day. I can pull it out if I need it long term. But I'm mostly going to spend out of my checking account still. And if there's an emergency, sure, I can tap into that long-term storage. that's sort of how your body is arranged as well, right? Like glucose can be used immediately, like cash, right? But you put that cash into a checking account and then you can spend it short term, right? That's like your glycogen. And that's mostly what we use. But then if you need long-term storage, that's where we would move it into our fat cells. So that's what insulin's job is, right? Insulin is meant to drive glucose into either your cells, your glycogen, or your fat cells, right? Now, what happens if your body can't get rid of that glucose? Let's say it just stays in your bloodstream. Well, it starts gumming up the works, right? Like, let's just say, you bring in a really sugary meal, it's Easter right now, right? Those freaking, what are they called? The eggs. Oh God, Easter chocolate eggs. What are those freaking things called? Oh, do you guys know what I'm talking about? They're like filled with this like sugar substance. Cadbury cream eggs. You guys ever had one of these? That is like the most sugary like thing on the planet. If I remember right, this little tiny egg, it's called Cadbury egg nutrition facts. This little egg, it's literally the size of an egg. Has 150 calories in it, with 20 grams of sugar. That's insane. I thought it was higher than that, actually. I thought it was like 300 calories. Is it a mini egg? Is that the tiny ones too? Sorry, this is like a whole conspiracy here. Maybe not. It was just 150 calories, but that's still, I mean, that's so much. But that's an insane amount of sugar, in this little tiny freaking thing. And so what happens is you get all that sugar, and now it's in your blood vessel, right? Now your body should make insulin to drive that sugar out and be used for energy, become glycogen, or become fat, right? But if you have type 1 diabetes, your pancreas can't make enough insulin. So what ends up happening is that sugar just stays in your blood. And now all of your other metabolic processes that your blood is responsible for, delivering oxygen, probably the biggest one, or metabolizing materials, or like delivering vitamins and minerals and things like that, can't do its job. There's a whole bunch of sugar in the way. Imagine if you just went to your job one day and someone's like, yeah, I don't know what happened. They filled our, you walk into work and they're just like, yeah, somebody dumped 10, truckloads full of sugar in here. You're just gonna be like wading through, you're trying to do your job and just like, you just can't, right? Like your keyboard is covered, like everything's messed up. The whole thing is just gummed up, right? That's what excessive sugar in your blood does. It's just gumming up the works, slowing every part of your metabolic processes down. So that's type 1 diabetes. Your pancreas doesn't create enough. Your immune system, for some reason, attacks your pancreas. It can't do its job. Can't produce insulin properly. That's pretty rare. That's less than 5% of all cases of diabetes. The remaining 95% of cases of diabetes are instead where the pancreas is actually working just fine. It is producing plenty of insulin. But what has happened is your body's receptors, your cells' receptors that take up that insulin in order to like do its job, drive sugar out of the blood, have become resistant to that insulin. So like you've produced so much insulin over time that now the body cells aren't listening anymore, right? The boy who cried wolf with this hormone, I always like to use the example of like coffee as sort of an analogy for this. Remember the first time you ever had coffee? Like I remember the first, I was like, right? It's like, my God, like when I was in college, coffee is how I survived. You know, it was the only thing like that got me through those years. Like, because I was working as a trainer at the time, and so like, you know, I'd work like 6 a.m., go to like an 8 a.m. class, come back and like work more sessions. You know, barely paying my bills. You know, not sleeping, not studying. You know, like, just trying to like live. You know, and coffee was my way. I used to take. If you've never done this before, guys, you got to try it. Take a coffee nap. It's the most incredible thing. You just kill a cup of coffee as fast as you can and then lay down, take a 25-minute nap or so. It takes about 25 minutes for caffeine to get through your digestive system and hit your bloodstream. You will wake up feeling like $1,000,000 because it's like right as the caffeine hits your blood, you are waking up from a nap. It's incredible. And I used to do that all the time. So anyway, now I drink a cup of coffee and it's like, I feel a little bit, you know, but definitely not as much as I did when I was like a younger, you know, brand new to coffee. And there have been times where I'm like, you know what, I'm going to take a couple weeks off. I'll take like 6-week breaks, no coffee, you know, let's see what happens. And then I'll come back to it and I'm like, ugh, and I get like kind of antsy, you know, and that's because I've sort of resensitized myself to it. By the way, guys, you can do that for those of you who might take like pre-workout. It's good to take planned pre-workout breaks, you know, resensitize yourself to that stuff. That's what happens to your sensory receptors. Your sensory receptors get so used to receiving something, they become less sensitive to it. That's what happens in type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes, 95% of all diabetic cases are where the body has actually become insulin resistant. So type 1 diabetes, you want to know the difference here. The body does not produce enough insulin. Type 2, the body has become resistant to insulin. And it is because, you know, we often have a lot of high sugar meals, you know, look at how much soda is here, you know, available in the US. Look at how much candy, look at how many like high sugar foods, right? You know, just look at like, you think of like oatmeal, right? Like we consider oatmeal to be like healthy, right? Oatmeal by itself, yeah, absolutely, incredibly healthy. You know, if you look at the nutrition facts surrounding like a regular thing of oatmeal, that's definitely not accurate. It's like 140 calories, you know, 4 grams of fiber, 28 grams of carbs, right? Maybe like, you know, a little bit of sugar. That's still the wrong one. Yeah, 1 gram of sugar in regular old oatmeal. You add a little bit of like banana to that, great. Now it tastes really sweet and it's really healthy for you, you know? But let's take a look at like what oatmeal looks like when it's got like stuff in it, you know? Like this is maple. This is a maple oatmeal here, right? Instant oatmeal, maple and brown sugar, right? 180 calories, which is not too dissimilar calorie wise, right? We had 150 calories before, but now we're seeing 180 calories. So it's only 30 more calories, right? Where is that extra 30 calories coming from? Well, same amount of fat. Now we see 37 grams of carbs with 14 grams of sugar in it, right? So 14 grams of sugar, that is 3.5 teaspoons of sugar in that little tiny cup, right? Or look at like a bottle of soda, right? You know, if you look at like a can of Coca-Cola, for instance, 39 grams of sugar, practically 40 grams, right? So that should be about 10 teaspoons worth of sugar in this can, right? We just see a lot of glucose. And unfortunately, all of that glucose is pretty much already broken down because it's already a pure sugar. So when it goes into your digestive system's like, I don't need to digest that, put it in the bloodstream. You know, it's already done. So it passes directly in and our blood sugar levels spike through the roof. Your body's like, holy crap, we're not supposed to have this much sugar. So it creates a massive amount of insulin. And then your body becomes resistant to that insulin. Just like if you were to drink 10 cups of coffee a day, eventually you're going to need 11 cups of coffee a day. You know, you're going to become resistant to it because you've given it so much. You need a larger and larger fix. So that's what diabetes is. Again, a definition for you guys to get familiar with. For those of you who have been through like our weight loss mod, like, I know Julio, you've seen that definition plenty of times. Chris, you've definitely seen that definition plenty of times, but definitely get familiar with these. And then the next one we're going to see is hyperlipidemia. So hyperlipidemia, this is elevated cholesterol levels. This is kind of going right hand in hand with hypertension. But if we look at our cholesterol, one of the things we got to remember is that there is a balance between your good and bad cholesterol. When I say good and bad cholesterol, what I mean is like HDL cholesterol is considered the good stuff. It's high density. So when it's running through your bloodstream, it's actually kind of cleaning out your blood vessels. It's knocking stuff off the walls. Let's say you get a little bit of cholesterol stuck on a blood vessel. Well, the high density stuff's going to come along and it's going to clean it off, right? As it, sort of passes through, and then eventually it'll make it to where it needs to go to become a metabolic process. So HDL cholesterol, high density cholesterol, is cholesterol that has lots of protein in it. And it's very dense and very good for you. This is the type of cholesterol associated with like your omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. This is the type of cholesterol associated with a high fiber intake in your diet, and the cholesterol that is often produced through like exercise, right? Versus your low density cholesterol, which is what we tend to have a lot of, that's often considered your bad cholesterol. Now, here's the thing. LDL cholesterol is not necessarily just bad. Like, it should be fine. It's just that we have way too much of it. Like, LDL cholesterol is still used in hormone production and cell production and all kinds of other stuff. We like LDL cholesterol when we don't have too much of it. But we live in a world where we have too much of it, like we have a lot of saturated fat in our diet, a lot of red meat, right? A lot of fat added to like, different foods and things. We have to have a way to make things taste good, so we have a lot of high sugar foods and we have a lot of high fat foods, right? That is sort of what we see. I'm going to a Dodger game this weekend, and you bet I'm getting a Dodger dog. Like that is happening. Birds fly, fish swim. I'm eating one of those things, and it is going to be packed full of cholesterol, saturated fat, probably even a little bit of trans fat, which should be avoided at all costs whenever possible. Not good, but tasty, and so that's our low density cholesterol. That's the kind of stuff that starts to build up on our blood vessel walls, right? And if that's the kind of choice that I make all the time, that's where I start putting myself at health risks, right? So that is what we are trying to avoid. So those are probably the 3 most common diseases we're going to run into. We're definitely going to see some more as we go through the rest of this course. But those are the ones I want you guys to be most familiar with. Definitely understand their definitions, definitely understand what's going on with the disease. And then if we know that, we are going to talk much more easily about sort of how to fix those things. So any questions so far, guys? How's everybody feeling?
I am feeling pretty good. So this is not too bad for me.
All right, love that. All right, so I got a question for you guys. If this is our special populations class and we are talking about like working with people who have specific diseases, let me ask you a question. How could, let's say you have a client and they tell you they have diabetes, they tell you they have the osteoporosis, they tell you they have peripheral arterial disease, something like that, right? And you're going to write a program based on that disease. Okay, great. I'm actually, I'm not against that. But how do you think that could be problematic? Like if you only base your current medical condition on, like if you're making your entire exercise routine based on that medical condition, what do you think some of the limitations or some of the drawbacks to that are? Like we call that diagnosis-oriented program design. What do you think the big drawback here would be? Sort of a class discussion question. Oh, come on. Someone be brave enough to unmute.
You say with oh my God, with diabetes, right?
Yeah, let's use that as an example, right? Let's say a client tells me they got diabetes, and I base my entire program for them on how to fix their diabetes. What do you think some of the limitations to that are? What's a trap that I could fall into?
Well, technically, out of sidebar, is that out of our scope of practice?
Ooh, actually, yes. Not necessarily the answer I'm looking for, but yeah, it would be if I'm treating diabetes through exercise, which is actually why we don't really use that term, because we don't want to tell our client that it's like, we're going to fix your diabetes. Don't say that. Now, that being
Got you.
said,
I think maybe just suggest to check the diet, like reduce the or limit the intake sugar or
yeah,
something like that.
absolutely. So we can do stuff like that. You nailed it, Danny. That's exactly like what our approach should be.
So nutrition guidance.
Yes, and that's the trap, right? We don't build meal plans for our clients because that's considered prescription. But what we can do, and this is a very gray area, but you can say like, I did build this diet. This is very good for a person with diabetes because it's a very low sugar diet that can help get your diabetes under control. If you want to like try this is a very good example of something you can do. See how like we worded that? I didn't say like, I want you to eat this. I said, this is a diet that would actually work very well for you. I'm leaving it up to them. That's the difference. A doctor would say, let's say you have a headache. A doctor would say, oh, take 2 Advil. What we would say, and honestly, try to stay away from medicine, but just as a teaching example, we would say something like, oh, well, Advil has been shown to be good for headaches. Right? Did I say take Advil? No.
Yeah, that's what I say, like suggest or recommend, but
exactly.
no.
So that's pretty good. That's not necessarily directly what I was looking for, but that is actually a really good one. So let me walk you through like why this actually could be problematic if you only base your exercise routines on someone's disease, right? It makes it very difficult for us as a trainer to address individuals, like work with someone who has multiple conditions. Right off the bat, let's say I've got a client who has, let's say I got a client with hypertension, and I've got a client who has, trying to think of a good example actually that would really contrast with that in sort of the opposite realm. Oh, let's say I've got a client who has hypertension, and I've got a client who is like pregnant, right? Those two are very different from one another. But let's just say like, they already had high blood pressure before their pregnancy, right? And their doctor was like, hey, you need to get physically active, right? So here's the thing. It's very important to make sure that somebody with hypertension doesn't change their head orientation too quickly. So doing things like hinging exercises, things that actually move the head around too fast, it's actually like not a very good idea for them because they can actually get dizzy and pass out because they have blood pressure problems, right? Their blood basically will pool in one area and it won't be able to move where it needs to go. And then all of a sudden they get dizzy and they'll feel faint. You guys have actually probably experienced that in moments of very low blood pressure. Your blood pressure drops very, very, very low if you've been sitting for a while. So if you've been doing nothing and then all of a sudden like, doorbell rings and you're like, oh, somebody's here, and you jump up and all of a sudden like you feel like the world's disappearing. That's actually low blood pressure because all your blood wants to stay on the couch. So one of the ways that we can train a client with diabetes is to go from upper body to lower body very consistently. And so what that does, it's like doing little reps for your blood vessels. So I do a lower body exercise, then I do an upper body exercise. I do a lower body exercise, then I do an upper body exercise. But it's very important to make sure that they're not changing their head orientation. So I shouldn't be doing like, let's say like a leg press, right? And then get up and do like a chest press and then do like a deadlift, right? Because like my head's moving around like crazy during all that. And that's going to be really hard on a client with hypertension. So I just need to make sure I keep them upright. a standing cable chest press, to maybe some body weight squats where they stay upright, right? To a standing cable row, into like a step up, right? They step up, right? Their head stays upright the whole time. So that's a really great routine for them. But now all of a sudden they're also pregnant, right? So you know what I have to make sure that I give them adequate time to like sit down, and then get back up, and then sit down and get back up. And if I'm doing this like whole thing with like hypertension, which should be done as a circuit, and I've got this client who needs to sit because, you know, shortness of breath is so common amongst prenatal like populations, they clash. It makes my program very difficult to build. So it doesn't make much sense to only base your base your program on a diagnosis. Rather, I'm going to skip forward for just a second. It makes sense to write your program based on what is a problem. So here's the thing that, and we're just laying this out here on day one, guys, because it's a trap that you can fall into. Don't fall into this trap. We are going to be talking about a lot of diseases and about how to fix a lot of diseases, but don't label your client based on those diseases, because it labels your client as dysfunctional rather than labeling them as measurably functional. You know what I mean? I certainly don't consider myself to be like a power lifter. You put me in the gym with like Brian Shaw or Eddie Hall or any of those huge, you know, Thor Bjornsson, you know, any of those like major freaking power lifter dudes, I'm not gonna be able to keep up, you know. But that doesn't mean, you know, if you see that and you're like, oh, well, he can't power lift because he can't, you know, the bar is up here and he's down, he can't do that, right? That doesn't mean that I shouldn't be engaging in those exercises, right? I'm measurably functional in that way, right? Not dysfunctional. So number one, it makes it very difficult for us to address multiple conditions. It also makes it very difficult to address clients who don't fit into one category, and it negatively affects your perception of your client's capabilities. You see them as dysfunctional rather than, you know, measurably functional, right? So the way I always like to think about this, like if I had a client who, you know, let's say I've got a client who's 500 pounds, which by the way, I've had plenty. You know, I used to work, when I worked for Biggest Loser, we had a lot of clients over the 500 mark. It was consistent, you know? So if you see that, you might think, oh my gosh, well, clearly that person shouldn't be getting on. You know, I've been told that the treadmill is high impact. That person shouldn't do the treadmill. Okay, yeah, well, they shouldn't be doing sprints on the treadmill because yes, that's going to be very hard on the joints. But you know what's great about treadmills? They can go at a very low speed sometimes, right? Or you know what? Like that's like, oh, well, you know, my doctor, you know, said that like I shouldn't walk too many minutes per day because it's too hard on my joints. If I hear that, okay, great. Can you walk in the pool? Because guess what? That takes all the pressure off your joints. And that's what we would do. We do a lot of aqua aerobics exercises with clients like that, and it would burn a ton of calories, you know. I have heard people say this nonsense before where they're like, when you get too large, you're not able to even exercise. You have to diet first and then you can exercise later. That is BS. There are plenty of forms of exercise out there that are not going to be too hard on the joints. You're going to have to do those specific forms for a little while, but eventually, you know, we're going to get you up. I had a guy, we'll call him Jack because I try not to use anybody's real names, but he was a truck driver. And he was, I want to say, my God, I used to have the number in my head. It was just under 550, but it was definitely over 5. I want to say it was like 540 pounds, something like that. He had a really rough start to the program. Like his family, it was basically like an intervention style, and that sucks for us as like a staff. That was like not a good scenario because he did not like, you know, he wasn't in the acceptance phase of like changing and like coming to engage in this program. He basically got kidnapped by his family from Arizona and like forcibly taken to our training facility, which is awful and 100% not how that should have gone.
That's intense.
Yeah, it very intense. And so like I was there the day on, I was doing orientation that day. And so like I remember him coming in and, you know, I was in my normal like, hey, how you doing? Like hospitality mode, you know. And dude was in tears. You know, his family basically dropped him off and then they just left. It was wild. And I was like, hey man, like, you all right? Like, and he's like, yeah. He's like, I think this, but he's like, I'm so scared. He's like, I think this is gonna kill me. And I was like, oh, buddy, like, no way. Like, we're here with, you know, like, you know, and I was like trying to be very optimistic with him. And I was like, you know, we're here to like, you know, make this work for you. And you know, sure enough, day one, I was like, look, he's like, how am I gonna hike? Hiking will, he's like, I think I'm gonna die. If I go on a hike, I think it'll be the enemy. Because that's what would always, we, you know, during orientation, we talked about how like there's basically about a 2-hour hike every morning. And I was like, well, you know what? Like the hikes are technically optional. I'm going to be here tomorrow morning. Why don't you stay back with me and we'll do a walk in the pool? And that's what we did for about 4 weeks until he went on his, what I call him, Jack. He went on his first hike. He went on the level 1 hike, you know, which is basically a property walk. But like eventually worked his way out. And like, I'm still friends with that guy on Facebook. He's down to, I think he's still in like the 300 mark. You know, this is only about like, you know, 3 years ago. But he's made like a lot of progress here and there. Lost about 250 pounds at this point. I think he's actually lower than that. Yeah, I think he's much lower than that actually. He's definitely under the 300 mark. But he's doing really well, you know. And so that's where it starts. So what I want you to think of, instead of like diagnosis oriented like approach, which Marvin, you made a good point, like that would also put us outside of our scope of practice. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take what's called the POEM approach, problem oriented exercise management, right? And so this is going to use very detailed assessments to determine what is dysfunctional and what we can address through general exercise. So rather than just like looking at a disease, Googling, you know, what should I do if I have osteoporosis, right? And we see, oh, increase your calcium and vitamin D. You know, that's very black and white. Looking that up right there. That's a diagnosis approach. You know, it's like increase your calcium and vitamin D uptake. What if you have totally adequate calcium and vitamin D uptake? You know, now obviously it's going to be rare. You know, if they have osteoporosis, chances are, yeah, that could be one of the causes. Limit your caffeine intake. Don't smoke. I already don't smoke. You know what I mean? Like, we're taking just the disease and we're just looking at a table and we're taking a very simplistic approach. That's not what we want to do. We are experts in this field. Our job is to look at what is problematic and address those things so that we can come up with a plan to address the problems, right? So exercise testing is a huge part of what we do. This is why we talk so much about assessments. Overhead squat, you know, push-pull assessments, static posture assessments, cardiovascular assessments, which we haven't talked about in a while. And it directs our exercise therapy directly towards problems that we can focus on and chip away at. It gives us tangible goals, which is also a huge advantage for us, because we know that like goals are like lightning in a bottle for our brains, you know? So it transforms this, like, you know, it transforms a problem like Jack, who, you know, is obese, has knee problems, he had low back problems, he was diabetic, he had a lot of like heart problems, right? It takes this incredibly complex series of problems and it breaks it down into like what we can address at specific times. And we're going to generally improve our client's health, which is going to reduce the incidence of all of those conditions, all of the disease. It's going to have a positive effect on literally everything. Does that make sense, guys? Do we see the distinction between what I'm talking about here?
Yes, sir.
Cool. Honestly, at the end of the day, if you want me to boil it down, it's just more specific. We're being specific to the client rather than specific to the disease. That makes a lot of sense, you know? We're not trying to draw any generalities here, you know? Actually, this is definitely analogous, not so much like a perfect example, but I got into an argument. It's so funny. Like, my buddy had someone visiting, and they were trash talking LA, I was like, look, I'm Oregon grown, and I think Oregon's the best state in the U.S. I love it there because I think it's beautiful. And they were like, and I was like, so like, LA is not my favorite place in the world, but like, you name me another city where like you can walk around at night, like, in t-shirt weather, like, I was like, you're drawing a lot of general negative stuff here, and like not any specific, positive stuff. And they're like, oh, but there's so much crime. And I was like, there's crime everywhere. Like, to say that is silly, you're being too general. So yeah, I got into a fun, healthy debate with this person the other day. So how do we do this, right? How do we, take these problems, and how do we address them? Well, we are going to do this through what we call evidence-based medicine. All of personal training actually is evidence-based medicine in some capacity. Basically, it's the practice of like, we've looked at scientific literature, we've determined what repetitions and what number of sets and what intensities you're going to do which things and how they're going to have positive benefits. Is it going to be black and white true forever? Probably not. We used to think long distance cardio was the best way to lose weight. Now we're finding that high intensity cardio is actually very effective. And guess what, guys? Nowadays, high intensity cardio is actually going a little bit out of style. We're seeing more and more of like that low intensity steady state cardio of like walking up an incline is one of the best ways to burn fat nowadays. Burns less calories for sure, but it's less impact on the body. It's a lot easier and you recover a lot faster. And it actually maintains muscle mass a little bit more effectively. So we used to think, go for a jog. Then we were like, oh no, go for some sprints. And now we're like, walk uphill. Those are very different pieces of advice. And it's just because things are going to change slowly over time. That's why it's evidence-based medicine. It's an evidence-based approach. The more we see new evidence, the more our opinions need to change. So we are going to approach things through what is called POEM, the problem-oriented exercise management, right? And it is this 5-step process here. It's going to start with collecting your subjective information. So your subjective information is any information that you can't necessarily measure. So, the disease itself is actually an example of subjective information. If I asked Chris, if he's dealing with any chronic conditions and he's like, oh yeah, doctor says that I have hypertension, right? Okay, great. Now I know that hypertension can lead to blood pressure problems. It can lead to dizziness and faintness, right? And sometimes nausea, right? I know that it can lead to those things, right? But what I don't know is how much that's going to affect Chris. Maybe he doesn't have any of those problems, even though he has, hypertension, right? As an example, right? So I need to gather my subjective information so that I know it, but I don't necessarily have to consider it as like being the problem. This is immeasurable. I don't know how much it's going to affect them. Their medication that they're on, that's subjective, right? I could say this many milligrams, right? And I know that maybe that lowers their blood pressure or lowers their heart rate, but maybe it only lowers my client's blood pressure and doesn't affect their heart rate at all. It's going to be different for everybody, right? So that's why it's subjective, right? You cannot measure how much of an effect it. You know it has an effect, you just don't know how much of an effect it's going to have. Even like somebody's occupation, their occupation, their hobbies, their lifestyle and diet, right? Those are all examples of really valuable information, but very subjective, okay? Then we need to collect our objective information. That's the measurable stuff. How tall is our client? How much do they weigh? What's their body fat percentage? What degree of angle do their knees cave in? What degree of angle do their arms fall forward, right? How fast can they run a mile? What does their heart rate recover to after like some type of assessment, right? So there's a lot of different assessments that we're going to do out there to gather our objective information. How much can they bench? You know, that's objective. It's very number-based, measurable data. You tell me you can bench 200 pounds now, and then you can bench 205 pounds later. I measured the difference, right? Both of those are valuable. Do not think that subjective or objective is more valuable than the other. They're both very valuable. Subjective is sort of the why behind things. Objective is sort of the what something is, right? So, you know, my client's blood pressure being 140/90, that's measurable. That's objective data. I can look at that drop down to 139. I can watch it drop to 138. I can watch the numbers go down over 6 to 12 or however long weeks, right? I can watch it change over time. That's measurable. But the disease, hypertension, how it affects them, how it makes them feel, that's subjective. Okay, both valuable. Then I need to formulate a plan. I need to come up with a plan and come up with a problem list. So I need to say, okay, you know, they experience shortness of breath, they experience dizziness, right? Their altered posture is affecting like how this joint can move, right? I'm gonna list out all of my problems and come up with a plan on how to fix that. And then I'm gonna implement it. I'm gonna take my client to the gym and I'm gonna train them, right? And I'm gonna continue documenting it slowly over time, right? So that is where we are going to use what is called SOAP notes. Now, this is actually in your textbook, but I guarantee you guys, if you end up working in like physical therapy as like a PTA or you know, just as a trainer on staff as a physical therapist, or if you end up working in some type of like medical approach, you're going to want to know how to do SOAP notes. It's a documentation tool. Not necessarily used by every trainer out there, but it's sort of like a flow chart. It's very helpful, right? So SOAP notes, SOAP is an acronym that stands for your subjective data, objective data, assessment, and plan of action. So we are going to see a whole bunch of examples of SOAP notes when you guys go through this class. Starting on Tuesday, we'll see our first example of a SOAP note. But it's going to be your client's subjective data. So that's going to be like your client's name. You know, in fact, actually, I'll just pull up an example here. Let me grab one here just as an example. So here's a SOAP note for a client named Mike. This is my plan for Mike, right? So he's recovering from a heart attack 6 months ago. He has been struggling with hypertension and peripheral arterial disease. Right, so he's got varicose veins, he's got PAD in his legs, he's got a lot of problems, right? His hobbies include playing cards, he likes playing bingo, he goes to lunch with his friends, likes to get coffee and stuff, right? He's a senior, right? He's 70 years old if I look at my objective data, right? He's retired, generally pretty sedentary. He's currently on a beta blocker, which is going to lower his heart rate and lower his blood pressure. And he has a constant pain in his legs, especially when he spends extended duration on his feet. So again, that's where his PAD is coming in. That's making him even more sedentary. So now I know a lot about him, right? Subjective information. Know a lot about my client. And I gathered it. I interviewed him, right? And then I'm going to gather some of the objective data. Like I say, 70 years old, his blood pressure is 140/90. His resting heart rate's 85. That's very fast for a senior of his age. Body fat percentage is 25%. It's actually a relatively normal range. I had him do what's called the Tug Test. That's actually an agility assessment for seniors. It took him about 15.2 seconds. So I'm going to look to see if that time can get shorter and shorter as we train him, make him more agile. He currently caves out with his knees when he does a squat, and his shoulders rounded, and he has a forward head posture. So of all the assessments that I did his chair sit to stand assessment instead of doing an overhead squat. That's how I figured out his knees cave in. I did a push-pull assessment. That's how I figured out he has the rounded shoulders and forward head posture. I did the Tug Test, and that was his agility, which he did not do great on, right? So I gather objective data. This is like figuring out your client's target heart rate, figuring out their waist to hip ratio, their BMI. Now, I didn't necessarily measure every one of those with him. I don't have his BMI listed here, I got his body fat percentage, I picked the ones that are most relevant to my client in this scenario, Rockport walk test, Davies test, those kind of things are great, but probably not very relevant to old Mike here, right? So now I need to come up with a plan of action. So now that I've done my assessment, right, I assessed the information. So I gathered subjective and objective data, and I wrote down the relevant information to him. And now I'm going to come up with a plan. You can see my plan is much larger than anything, right? So my plan of action is going to be to continually use the talk test while I'm training him, right? So like that's going to be doing like the RPE method to measure his intensity, right? I'm going to say like, hey, continually check in with him and see how he's doing. I'm going to warm him up for a very long time, right? With that PAD, I want to make sure that I'm easing in with that heart disease and ease him in. And I'm going to cool him down for a very long time. So that's going to be about 10 minutes on the treadmill every time, just getting him warmed up and cooled down, right? I'm definitely going to avoid some isometrics. That is something I'm going to be teaching you guys later because isometrics can actually raise blood pressure. So we'll lift him at a 4-1-1 tempo. And then we're going to focus on active isolated stretches rather than static stretches, because again, that's going to be very good for his hypertension. So we'll do slow rhythmic stretching. And then these are the muscles we're going to work on: upper traps, pectorals, lats, right? Those muscles we saw yesterday. He was a knee cave outer as well. So TFL, glutes, and piriformis. He's going to do cardiovascular training. I'm going to encourage him to get up and walk 3 times a day for 10 minutes. I'm not having him do a super long session. That's going to hurt his PAD, right? So I'm going to have him do like slow, little tiny sessions, 10 minutes at a time. And then he's going to do resistance training on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And we'll talk about like what that looks like later. So obviously I moved through that very quickly, but that is actually how SOAP notes are going to be implemented, right? We get our subjective information, right? That's all the information about our client's lifestyle. Do they sit for extended periods of time? Do they have repetitive movements in their life? Do they wear dress shoes? You know, do they have a lot of mental stress? Past injuries, chronic diseases, surgeries, or medications. Objective data. That's going to be like their target heart rate, what their pulse is, their blood pressure, body mass index, anything with a number, guys. Anything with a number, right? What their YMCA step test score was, what their pacer test score was, what their static posture assessment looks like, what their movement assessments look like. Then we'll look at objective, more objective data. Push-up test, Davies test, you know, strength assessments. You know, maybe I want to know what their 1 rep max is, or maybe I want to know what their balance is, right? Hand-eye coordination. This right here, this is the STAR excursion test. These are the stuff we're going to be going over the next couple weeks. Next week. Then I'm going to come up with I'm going to take that assessment data. I'm going to assess it. I'm going to separate all the relevant information and write it down, and then formulate my plan. Okay. Now you can also do a little bit of this without an exercise. Like, let's say you get a client who comes in, you know, it's their first session, they want to train, and, you know, you've done a little bit of assessment with them. You know, exercise tests, super helpful because they give you very valuable data, but you do have to sort of calculate with them. You know, you have to take it back and run the numbers and, you know, formulate a plan. What if you have a client that you're trying to sell personal training to, who, you know, you did your assessment in about 30 minutes, you got 30 minutes left with this person, right? What are you going to do? Well, you can also base it on their rating of perceived exertion. So if we think about like what their cardio looks like in terms of like perceived exertion, you can ask them. You know, I can check in and say like, hey, Marvin, how you feeling? You know, on a scale of like 1 to 10, how difficult was that last exercise, right? I can check in with them regularly. So these are our target heart rate zones based on their heart rate percentages, right? But we can also use what's called the Borg scale. Okay, we can use a level of perceived exertion. Exercise should start somewhere around a 12 to 13 on the scale of 6 to 20. 6 being basically no exertion at all. Now you guys are probably at a 6 right now. And then 20 being like maximal effort sprint. I find that really hard to translate. I find that people tend to work better on a 1 to 10. So we use the modified Borg scale. Exercise starts somewhere around like a 3 or a 4. right? And then like moderate exercise gets into like 4 or 5. Medium exercise gets into like 6 or 7. High intensity is like 8 to 9, with 10 being like basically, you're tapping out, you're ready to throw up, Now, obviously, we do also need to take into account medications that our clients are on, that can affect the heart rate. And so that's actually one of the reasons why we like this Borg scale a little bit better than actually using heart rate sometimes, right? Beta blockers can reduce your heart rate. So if you have a client who's on a beta blocker, right? Let's say Cyrus, let's say we calculate out our client's target heart rate, but they're on a beta blocker. So I put them on a treadmill and I'm like, hey, you're doing great. And I'm hitting that plus sign and just murdering my client, Meanwhile, they're like trying to like have trouble keeping up. Yeah, their heart is artificially lower due to that medication. So be aware of that as well. Sometimes medications will have paradoxical effects is what they call it. And it's where like sometimes you'll see medications can actually have the opposite effect that they're supposed to have sometimes after they start exercising. So there's a list in your textbook in the assessments chapter that is going to have a general idea of what medications are prescribed for. You guys can get familiar with those, but I don't recommend memorizing them. I recommend knowing how to look them up. And then here is the effects that they're going to have. So like a beta blocker can lower heart rate and blood pressure, whereas a calcium channel blocker will raise heart rate but lower blood pressure. So a doctor will prescribe those based on what the client needs. If the client has like a racing heart, they'll probably put them on a beta blocker. But if they have like a slow heart but still high blood pressure, they'll probably put them on a calcium channel blocker. So you just want to be aware of those and be aware of that Borg scale. And that's the stuff we are going to be practicing over the next week. So today was really kind of an intro day. It was a lot of like bits and pieces of random information. Monday, we're going to get a little bit more specific with things. And then on Tuesday, we're going to start breaking down our first populations. But that's about it, guys. Any questions today? How's everybody feeling? Is that a little simpler than
I just
Much better than last week.
I believe you. What's that, Danny?
Can you do me a favor? Can you put the name of the book?
Yeah.
Just to take a screenshot and looking for it.
Yeah, I'd probably do the 3rd edition if I were you, just because it's so much cheaper. But it's ACSM. That's NASM's biggest competitor.
Okay.
Get out of here. Exercise management for chronic diseases.
I got it. Thank you.
And it's good, like I said, but honestly, you would not read through that whole textbook. I would never read through that whole textbook, just so you know. What I would do is, I got a client, they tell me they have osteoporosis, and then I'd be like, great, and I would like write everything down. And then when I'm at home, I would look through and read the osteoporosis one and use that to write my program. That's how I would use it.
Yeah.
It's not meant to be memorized. That's too much.
Yeah, just to like a reference.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, fellas. Well, I'm gonna kick you all out of here, and I'll see you on Monday.
All right, Brad. Have a good weekend.
All right.
Yeah.
Have a good weekend,
Bye,
everybody.
guys. All right, bye.
Thank you.